Sometimes the most convincing ideas are the ones that mix truth with exaggeration. Now, according to a growing number of social media commentators, you're not really experiencing reality anymore. Not even right now that you're watching this. You're simply experiencing a script. A narrative machine that assigns heroes, villains, outrage cycles, and political theatre, all designed to control how you think. And it sounds unsettling. But here's a question we should ask ourselves. If this system is really controlling everything, how could anyone possibly see through it? So today we're going to examine the idea carefully and see what actually holds up to scrutiny. Welcome to In Plain Sight, the podcast where we step back from the noise and ask a very simple question. What's actually true and what just sounds convincing? Every so often a piece of commentary appears online that feels like it explains everything, whether it be politics, media, social division, or the endless cycle of outrage. Now, recently I watched a video by behaviour analyst Chase Hughes where he argued that modern society operates inside something like a narrative situation. And according to him, reality itself isn't what shapes public understanding anymore. Stories do. Politics become theatre, and the media becomes narrative framing. And human beings, well, we're just characters inside someone's pre-written plot. And it's an idea that sounds unsettling, and in some ways it does contain elements of truth, but it also contains something else. It contains a series of conclusions that go far beyond any evidence that exists. So today, I want to slow the whole thing down, because the goal of this podcast isn't to win an argument. It's simply to ask what is actually true and what just sounds convincing. Now, he said that reality is mediated. Now, one of the first claims in the video is that we no longer experience reality directly. He believes that instead we experience interpretations of reality, headlines, narratives, social media frames. Now, this idea in itself isn't controversial. Communication scholars have been studying this for decades. And the media absolutely influences how events are interpreted. Of course it does. A protest, for example, can be framed as a peaceful demonstration or a riot or a civil rights movement or a public disturbance. The event itself is real, but interpretation varies. However, Hughes takes it to the next step and suggests that because interpretation exists, reality itself has therefore been replaced. And that's where his argument begins to stretch credulity, because interpretation is not the same thing as replacement. The world is still experienced directly every single day. People still live lives grounded in physical reality, whether it be families, work, relationships, communities, socializing. Media shapes perception, but it doesn't erase reality. Now, he then goes on and has this idea of 6 layers of manipulation. And his video introduces a structured framework of 6 layers, which are mediated reality, human conditioning, the collapse of information, fear and identity control, narrative warfare, and the theatre of power, all very overly dramatic. But it sounds scientific, and yet it isn't actually recognized in any model of psychology or sociology whatsoever. It's a narrative framework created by him and him alone. And that is a distinction that matters, because when something's presented as a structured system, it can feel authoritarian even when it's speculative. And academic research on media influence does exist. Of course it does. But it describes a messy ecosystem of competing instructions, technology incentives, human behavior, human manipulations. It isn't a single coordinated machine, which we know it isn't when you think about it. He then went on to say that fear drives engagement. Now, at one point, Hughes raises that it's supported by research, the idea that fear and outrage spread quickly online, and emotionally charged content gets more engagement. This has been observed repeatedly in studies of social media. That isn't a surprise. Strong emotions do make people comment more, share more, argue more. And platforms optimize for engagement. But that doesn't mean that fear is being deliberately engineered to control society. The more mundane explanation is probably it's simply attention economics. Platforms are competing for your time. We spend most of our days on social media, and emotion is effective at capturing that time. The driver's profit. It's not a coordinated manipulation architecture. The drive is simply profit. And one thing that's ironically interesting about his whole rhetoric is that he's doing the very thing that he's then going on to say we are being orchestrated to partake and get involved in. He is relying on what he is saying with his dramatic backgrounds and his dramatic music and his dramatic headlines and his dramatic, telling of this narrative, staring sternly at the screen. He is accessing your emotions. He wants you to react emotionally, and he's doing the very thing that he is claiming is part of societal manipulation. He's optimizing his platform for engagement by selling the story the way that he sells it. Which leads me to the next aspect of politics is theatre. He claims that modern politics is essentially a form of theatre, that it exists primarily just to absorb attention like a sponge rather than solve problems. And again, this isn't a new criticism, it's existed for a long, long time. Political scientists have described something called symbolic politics, where basically political actors communicate values and identity as much as actual policy. And yeah, modern media environments do amplify dramatic conflict. But again, Hughes moves from observation to exaggeration. Politics is not only theatre. Governments still make decisions that affect, I don't know, taxation, healthcare, infrastructure, education, law, more. And those decisions have very real consequences that we feel every day of our lives. Calling politics entirely performative ignores the enormous amount of real work that happens beyond the scenes, and it's a bit reductive. Now, he then goes on to claim that narratives assign heroes and villains. Now, as an author, I can relate to this because he suggests that modern narratives follow mythic structures: hero, villain, victim, and that those once roles that were assigned to logic has now disappeared. And there's actually some psychological research supporting some part of this. Humans do understand stories, we do, through narrative structures. That's why we like films and movies and theatre. Our brains evolved to process information through storytelling. That doesn't mean that people lost their ability to reason. It simply means that narratives are a powerful communication tool, and they always have been, and they always will be. Religious texts, national history, literature, political speeches, they've always used narrative structures for thousands and thousands of years. This is not a modern interpretation or manipulation of a system. It's just human culture, and that is where he's wrong. He then goes on to talk about moral signaling and identity. Now, Hughes suggests that morality is just symbolic. It doesn't matter anymore. That people display values through social media signals rather than actual lived behavior. And again, there is some sociological evidence that social media encourages public signaling of beliefs. That is true. But again, it's not a new behavior. Public expressions of moral identity have existed for centuries, long before social media. Clothing, whether it be religious or otherwise, political badges, protest signs, campaign slogans that we see all the time from our politicians. Human beings have always used symbols to express their personal values. Social media just provided a faster stage, but it isn't new and it isn't innovative. The idea that stories control everything is also incorrect. The most dramatic claim in his video is that whoever controls the narrative controls society. Hashtag David Icke. And that politics, media, identity, and fear are all components of a single narrative control system. Yeah, this is where he runs into a very simple problem. The modern information environment is chaotic by its very nature. Thousands of competing narratives exist simultaneously. Governments argue with journalists, journalists argue with politicians, journalists argue with each other, academics challenge media coverage, they challenge evidence, other scientists bring forth new research, citizens challenge politicians. If a single narrative system existed, this level of a group disagreement literally wouldn't be possible. Instead, what we're seeing is something that's actually far messier. It's a marketplace of competing stories, and some are accurate, some are flawed, some are manipulative, some are somewhere in between the truth and fantasy, but none are fully dominant. Now, the psychological effects of these narratives are ironically the kinds of stories that Chase Hughes likes to tell, because he knows they produce the very emotional response that he's criticizing. A sense that everything can be manipulated, that nothing is trustworthy, that society is secretly engineered, and that feeling can make the world seem darker than it actually is. But the reality in plain sight is far, far simpler. Human societies are complicated. Information systems are imperfect and break down. Media environments simply amplify drama. None of that requires a hidden simulation or narrative machine. It just is. So, yes, stories influence how we understand events. Of course they do. Yes, media framing exists. Of course it does. Just look at the recent Donald Trump debacle. Yes, political messaging simplifies complex realities. But human beings, we're not passive characters inside a scripted narrative. We argue, we question, we debate, we investigate, we're curious, we change our minds. My wife changes her mind a lot. And the fact that we can even have conversations like this is proof the system isn't nearly as controlled as Chase Hughes would like people to believe. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply step back from all the drama and remember something very boring and ordinary. Reality is still right here. Before we finish today, I would like to leave you with a thought. One of the strange things about modern information world is that two completely opposite stories can circulate simultaneously. One story says everything is fine, nothing's wrong, and anyone who questions the system is paranoid or a conspiracy theorist. The other story says everything's controlled, nothing's real, and the entire world is operating inside a giant psychological manipulation machine. And both of those stories are comforting in their own way because they remove probably the hardest possibility that reality is far more complicated than either explanation. Yes, media shapes perception. Yes, social media amplifies outrage. Yes, politics sometimes rewards performance more than actual substance. But none of that means the world is a scripted simulation. It just means we live in a noisy, imperfect human system with millions of people talking at once, with competing ideas, competing incentives, competing narratives. It's messy, frustrating, annoying, sometimes manipulative, but still fundamentally wide open. And the fact that you can watch a video claiming the system is manipulating you and then watch another video calmly analyzing that claim is proof itself that the system isn't nearly as controlled as people would like you to believe. Because real control systems do not allow critique. They wouldn't allow me to do this. Real control systems don't allow open debate. They don't allow you to question the narrative at all. Yet here we are, still questioning, still debating, still thinking. And that means the most powerful thing any of us can do right now is actually really, really simple. Slow down, step outside the outrage cycle, touch grass, as they say, and remember something that is still true even in this chaotic media environment that we live in. Reality has not disappeared. It is still just where you left it. Might be quieter than the noise, but it's always in plain sight.